and I saw my dad on the side of the bed, weeping and sobbing. It scared me. Because for the very first time, my dad was vulnerable. In Gethsemane, it's hard to see Jesus so vulnerable. Here in Gethsemane, he was already experiencing the horror of the cross. Do y'all remember the first time you saw your dad cry? I do. I've told you about my dad. My dad was the toughest man I've ever met. My dad was not just retired Navy. My dad was old school Navy. He was an old school sailor. Tattoos up and down his arms when it was just bikers and sailors who had tattoos. He was tough as nails. One time when we lived in Virginia Beach, I love to tell the story, we lived in a trailer park that was right next to a golf course, and we would slip under the fence, and there was a creek right there. And one day as kids were playing there, and my dad was outside doing yard work, and we saw a copperhead snake. And we were like, there's a snake! And we were all scared, and these golfers, these men came over there, and they saw the snake, and they're like, it's a snake! My dad heard all the commotion. My dad, hoe in one hand, drink in the other, cigarette in his mouth, walks down the hill without saying a word, just looks at that snake, boom, chops his head off with that hoe, and calmly walks up the hill again, never once spilled his drink. And I looked at the other kids like, that's my dad. Tough. But then my Uncle Ronald died. My dad was out to sea when it happened, and when he flew in to where we were in Adzuki, Japan, that night, I heard something I'd never heard before. I was in the hallway, and I looked into my parents' room, and I saw my dad on the side of the bed, his hands folded like this, his face in his hands, weeping and sobbing. My mom was right next to him, caressing him. And as a second grade kid, I didn't know what to do with that. It scared me. Because for the very first time, my dad was vulnerable. For the very first time, my dad wasn't Superman. He was human. I appreciate it now, but at the time it made me so uncomfortable. In Gethsemane, it's hard to see Jesus so vulnerable, so human. But it's important that we remember what our theology is, especially at Christmas, the incarnation. Jesus was 100% God, and he was 100% man. He was God the Son, but God the Son made flesh. He can sympathize with our every weakness. He knows everything we've been through. When Jesus told Peter, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak, how did he know? He knew because he was in the flesh. He knew what all that came with it. Now, the word Gethsemane means oil press. And it's fitting because it's become synonymous with places of deep pressing pain and agony. It's a place where you fall on your knees and you plead with God. God, if there's any other way. God, if you can stop this, do it. God, if you can make all this go away, please. God, if you can just make things better. Dad, if you can be strong and not cry. It's a place where we say, God, do something. But it's a place where we also decide. It's a place where we say, not my will, but your will be done. It's a place where we go and say, God, even if it hurts, even if I grieve, even if I don't understand, I will trust you, and I know what I want, but God, I want what you want more than anything else. So Lord, not my will, but your will be done. And that's hard. So what do we do with this image? Alistair Begg spoke on this, and he said there are three things we want to do. Look at him, listen to him, learn from him. Look at him. Look at him with his face to the ground, dirt in his hands, prostrate on the ground, sobbing and weeping. Listen to his prayer to his Father and learn from him. And I'm going to add a fourth thing. Love him. Love him because you see what he endured and what he went through and what he decided to do for us on our behalf. So let's look at this together, and we're going to first see the anguish of Jesus. Look at verse 36. Then Jesus went with his disciples to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to them, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." He took Peter and the two sons of Zebedee along with him, and he began to be sorrowful and troubled. And then he said to them, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me." Now, we like to think that the cross was easy for Jesus, that Jesus somehow knew the cross was coming and he just kind of skipped his way there, and it was just part of the process of him getting to the resurrection and finishing our salvation for us. But no, the cross was something Jesus dreaded. Remember when Peter made the good confession? He said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus said, "You're right, Peter." And for the first time, Jesus told the disciples, "Now let me tell you where I'm going. I'm going to be betrayed. They're going to take me. They're going to arrest me. They're going to kill me. They're going to hang me on a cross." And Peter looked at him and said, "That's nonsense, Jesus. That will never happen to you. You're Jesus." Remember what Jesus said to Peter? "Get behind me, Satan, because you don't have in mind the things of God, but the things of men." It was hard for Jesus. And so here at this moment, and this is so powerful, Jesus is starting to experience this, and one of the things he does is he says, "I need to pray," but then he tells his disciples, "Pray with me." And he goes a little bit farther, and he grabs Peter, James, and John and says, "You three, pray with me." Think about that. Jesus, the Son of God, in such distress, such sorrow, says, "I need you to pray with me." Where this really hit me is that I was part of a Bible study when I was younger, and we had a guy in the Bible study. His name was Marlo Robinson, this older man. No relation, but awesome last name. But Marlo had been in Vietnam, and he was a young officer, and when he had his first firefight, he said it felt like it lasted 2 hours, but it only lasted about 5 minutes. But he said in just that 5 minutes, he lost about 5 or 6 men. Many others were wounded. And he had never been so scared in his life. But in all of his training, he was taught never show any fear, any weakness. Never let your men see you question anything. Because if they see you, then they will feel that fear. And you've got to be strong for them. And so he said that after the firefight, he had his sergeant take his men over the hill and down a ways while he went the other way. And he said he sat there and just cried and wept. And he says that when he reads this, what impresses him so much is that at this moment of weakness, Jesus is not pushing his disciples away. He's pulling them closer. He says, "Come be with me. See me like this. Pray with me. Be there with me." And on a side note, One of the greatest signs of strength you could have is when you ask for help. Is when you say, will you pray with me? Will you pray for me? Will you be with me at this moment? Now I know some of us, we're strong, we got the bravado, we don't need anybody. Well, let me ask you, do you think you're greater than Jesus Christ? If at this moment Jesus says to his disciples, come pray with me, who are we to think that we can do it on our own? We need others. And notice that it says here that he began. He began to be sorrowful. Tim Keller points out that this is a progressive present tense, meaning that what began in the garden would be carried on and completed later. So what began in the garden would last to the cross. So what began here? What began was the horror of the cross. What began was the experience of the cross, the agony of the cross. It started here in Gethsemane. The pain, the agony, the sorrow. Best way I can explain this, I told you about my dad. When my dad was dying, I was in Starkville, Mississippi. I had to go to Louisville, Kentucky, and I knew that he was in the hospital bed. I knew he was dying. I knew the shape he was in. And I knew what I would see when I walked into the hospital room. But y'all, when I stepped into that hallway and I could see the room down there, I felt it then and there. And every step I took was so hard because I knew what was there, but I was already feeling it. And that's what Jesus was experiencing here in Gethsemane. He was already experiencing the horror of the cross. He was experiencing the pain. And the words where it says he was sorrowful and troubled doesn't quite express it. It was horrible. He was horrified. He fell to the ground. It was such painful, such agony, such misery that he literally fell on his face and began to pray. He was overwhelmed to the point of death. But what was it? What was it that made him fall like that? What was causing so much pain and agony? Verse 39 says, going a little farther, he fell with his face to the ground and prayed, my Father. Notice how he says, my Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me, yet not as I will, but as you will. This cup. Now, we as Westerners look at that, we think, oh, wow, that's a great image, it's just a beautiful thing. But to the Jewish mind, the cup represented God's righteous judgment and wrath upon sinful man. It was God's justice against sin. And when Jesus says, let this cup pass me by, that's what he was talking about. This cup of God's wrath, this cup of God's justice. And what is at the core of God's justice? The ultimate judgment against sin is separation from God. There's a verse that when I read it, it scares the living daylights out of me. And it's 2 Thessalonians 1:9. It says, they will be punished, meaning unbelieving, unrepentant sinners, will be punished with an everlasting destruction. And here it is, and shut out from the presence of the Lord and from the majesty of his power. Think about even here in our world today, the most awfulest person still experience God's grace and God's goodness every day. But imagine being pushed out of his presence and all that presence brings with it, the goodness, the love, the mercy. Imagine being in a place where there was no love, no mercy, no grace, no beauty, nothing. And think about how horrible that is for us. But we know what it's like to be sinners. But Jesus, he who knew no sin, became sin for us. Jesus, who was perfect in every way, God the Son, who was with God, who was God, began to experience something that he had never experienced before. And that is, for the first time, God the Son felt God the Father begin to pull away. For the first time. And so he says, if it is possible, let this cup pass me by. Mark adds that Jesus says, Abba, Father, all things are possible with you.